Alright, what is up my homies? Welcome to BrainMelt University. Today we're going to continue covering topics that aren't typically related to computer science and information technology, and that is the idea of mind maps. What is a mind map? How do you use them and how do they work? So what is a mind map? In simplest terms, a mind map is a visual aid that's designed to help you break complex systems down into their simpler components. It is a way for us to take something that is way too difficult to try and grasp by itself and instead look at the individual things that make it up and break those down into easier to understand components. Instead of trying to learn a 20-step process, maybe it's easier to break that down into 5 separate 4-step processes. It's a lot easier to memorize 5 sets of 4 than it is to memorize 1 set of 20. That's the essential idea around a mind. So what do mind maps look like? Mind maps can take a number of different forms. Some people will make mind maps that look similar to a group of post-it notes that are organized in a very specific fashion. Other people will create mind maps that are very similar to, say, a Prezi or a PowerPoint presentation. The most common way that you see mind maps represented is through a series of cells with interconnecting lines that show which cells are related to each other and how. Regardless of how you choose to represent a mind map, you should be taking into account certain things when you're building one. For instance, who is your intended audience? Are you building this mind map for yourself to help you understand something that is complex? Or are you building this for a school class assignment? Or are you building this for a work project? Are you building this to share with other people? Or is this strictly for your own personal reference? Knowing who the audience is can really help nail down what level of detail we need to be including. If you're building a mind map just for yourself, it's okay to keep things vague or to go as in-depth as possible. But when you're building for an audience, you need to include the amount of information that is relevant to your audience. You need to be able to provide enough information that they're able to follow along with this mind map, but you also need to pare down some of the information to the point where it's only relevant and necessary for them to know. If you're building a mind map about a series of computer networks to another group of IT professionals, then you're probably going to want a decent level of detail there. But if you're giving the same presentation to a group of managers, they might not need all the technical details and they just need the broad spectrum, high level understanding. This is why it's important to know who your intended audience is. It's also important to know how much time you're going to need to present it. If you're just building a mind map for your own personal reference, then you don't really need to take things like time constraints into account. But if you're having to present in, say, a 20-minute presentation, then you need to make sure that the level of detail is appropriate to the amount of time you have to present. So knowing how they're used, knowing why we use them, and knowing what they're supposed to do is one thing, but how do we actually build one? Well, I'm actually going to jump in and do a quick demo for this video. So don't go anywhere. You left, didn't you? Well, okay, getting started. So here we are at Miro.com. So this is a free online service that allows you to do a number of different sorts of visual charts, but this is also a good mind mapping piece of software. Another really good one that I actually prefer to Miro is XMind, but a lot of people prefer Miro, so that's the one that I'm using. So after you've created your account and you set up your board, you're free to begin working with a different sort of chart. So I could use a stickies capture type if I'm trying to do just like a group of post-it notes for related items, or I could try and actually build some sort of chart, which is pretty difficult to do with a mind map. Or I could try doing something similar to, say, a Kanban board. If you're used to project management, you should be familiar with what that particular diagram is. But in this case, I'm just going to use their default mind map layout. All right, so after I have my mind map layout, you'll usually see some sort of cell, and this is where you're going to put your big idea. This is the major thing that you're trying to encapsulate. So for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm just gonna mind map out what is required for a successful camping trip. So the first thing you'll see is that it automatically tries to build to the right. Now you can build in pretty much any direction you want. So you can build left, right, you can build vertically. or you can do lots of different things. So in this particular case, I'm just gonna go ahead and undo that. And I'm gonna build to the right, because that's usually just how my brain works. So what I usually like to recommend is that where possible or where necessary, you should include a set of prerequisites. So what needs to be in place for this to work? So if I have prerequisites, what are some prerequisites for a camping trip? Well, first and foremost, we need to know how many people are going, because how many people are going is going to determine where we can actually camp. We need to know what sort of campsite we're going to have. So after we have how many participants, we can create another block that goes off of here, and we can say, where are we going? So knowing where we're going is also going to be important, because that lets us know which vehicles we can take. Are we going to be on very, very nasty, bumpy dirt roads that you wouldn't necessarily want to take a car? You would need a pickup or an SUV to get there. Or is this a location that someone can get to in their Chevy Volt? Once we have all of our list of prerequisites, then we can determine what we're going to do. So now I can build a timeline. So how long are we going to be camping? This is going to be pretty big. So I'm actually going to link my timeline up here, and you can change what order they appear. So you don't get stuck when you're making these with where you're going. So you can determine pretty easily how these mind maps are going to be organized. So whatever means work best for you is how you can do it. So we can say how many participants, how long are we going, and where are we going? So now that we have a list of prerequisites, we have timeline, how many participants, etc., we can also say what we're going to do. We can come up with an activities list. And if I'm doing a camping trip, I would probably want my activities to be planned day by day. So say we're doing a 3-day camping trip. I can also do day 2 and day 3. So we have a 3-day trip lined up. And I'm just going to go ahead and take that last day away. So day 1, first thing we're gonna have to do is we're actually gonna have to clean up the campsite, because they're not always ready to go, right? Sometimes you have sticks and leaves everywhere. Sometimes you have other people who have messed up their campsite, etc. So the first thing we should do on day 1 is we should actually clean up. So after we have that, another thing that we need to do is we need to set up our campsite. So we need to set up camp. And set up camp can have many branches on it, because you might need to set up a number of things. So for instance, you might need to set up an outhouse. You might not necessarily be camping in a spot that has facilities ready to go. So you might have to set up an outhouse. And some other things that might go with set up camp might be to set up a kitchen. So you might need camp stoves, you might need a fire pit, whatever you need to prepare your food, you need to set up a kitchen area. If you're in an area that has a lot of bears, then you might need some sort of food storage system set up. If you're in an area that has bears, you need to hang your food off the ground in a tree somewhere that's usually pretty far away from your camp, etc. Of course, you need to be able to set up your facilities where you're sleeping. So whether you're setting up tents, setting up campers, etc., you need to have a plan for set up shelter. So once you have all of these things in place, you have your camp setup done on day 1. Now you can go even more in depth into this. So say for instance, set up an outhouse, you can break this into the subtasks, which is dig a hole, build a seat, build a shelter, and build a privacy screen. So these are all things that you would take into account if you were setting up an outhouse. So you can go as in-depth or as high level as you feel necessary. If you're trying to do this as a how-to for someone who's never been camping before, then maybe you need to go into depth on a lot of this stuff. So for instance, the food storage. If we're going into a place where there's bears, you would probably have to explain to them how to do a food run. But these are just examples. So this is how you would build a mind map. So this is just a basic example for mind mapping a camping trip. Now I'm not gonna do the entire trip. That's a little unnecessary for the purpose of this video, but this is something to keep in mind. So if you're building a mind map, you can do this for any number of things. You can do this whether you are doing for business, for trying to motivate employees, or you can do this for some sort of work project or school project. You can do this for a number of different activities, and not all of them are related to computer networking and cybersecurity, but these are things that you do need to keep in mind as you're building a mind map. So whether you have a professor who's actually assigning something like this, or whether you're just trying to do this to break down complex tasks into simpler tasks, then you most certainly can build a mind map. Also, by using this layout, you can see how everything is related. So prerequisites, this is pretty much just saying, how do we determine what this trip is going to look like? Day one, we know that we need to do some cleanup work, which we can expound on that if we need to. Set up camp. This gives a pretty detailed idea for what we need to set up before we can actually start playing. I mean, camping isn't all about fun. Sometimes you actually have to do some work before you can relax. And here we see how certain tasks can really start to be broken down. So that is an example of a mind map. This is kind of a shoddy one. This is one that I just kind of threw together at a moment's notice, but I did want you to kind of see how these are put together. And it does give you an idea of what I would expect to see if I was an instructor who was giving this assignment. And there you have it. That is a mind map. That is how you build them. That's how they work. And that's just kind of a basic description of the Miro software. Like I said, I kind of prefer Xmind. It's a little bit cleaner and nicer, but a lot of students tend to prefer that one, which is why I use that. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to drop them down below. And I hope to see you all here next time at Brainmelt University.